Hey guys, so I just recently finished watching the new South Park special TV movie called Post COVID. I do want to mention something rather quickly that I remember back a few years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago, when there was talks that Trey Parker and Matt Stone were actually looking for an exit out of South Park, and there were rumors that they were splitting up, things like that. But yet now 6 years later, here we are, and they have signed a contract with Paramount to make, I think, six more seasons and 14 new special TV movies. And post COVID is the first one of these 14 new specials. So the special was dropped on Paramount Plus. The story that revolves around this is it's a time skip 40 years into the future. And so we have the boys, Kyle, Stan, Cartman, everyone 40 years or 40 years older. And so the boys are all middle-aged, living their own lives, doing their own things. And a tragedy, the death of Kenny, who is now a world-renowned scientist, has passed away, and they are all really, a lot of the familiar faces come back to South Park for his funeral. And while they're there, the boys begin to suspect that Kenny's death might not have been as straightforward as it appears, and they begin to uncover a plot conspiracy that deals with Kenny's work into the COVID virus. I did like that the plot of this special is basically one of the longest running gags of the show, which is the death of Kenny. And I think that one of the interesting aspects about this special, and one of, I think, the main selling points, is that we get to see the boys be adults. It's interesting to see where they all ended up in. We see, Cartman surprisingly very shocking reveal that he is a rabbi, and that Kenny was this world renowned scientist. And then also Jimmy, who is a late night show host. You have these characters who, in hindsight, people didn't really expect them, like if they had like a life trajectory, it's something that people weren't expecting from them. And then we have Stan, who is this online alcohol consultant, so he's struggling in life. And then we have Kyle, who's some weird psychologist who's working on this startup. So these two characters, who aren't doing really well and who you'd expect them to be doing well, but they're not. I was a bit disappointed that we didn't get to see a lot of the parents. Did get to see Stan's dad. There's a plot where he has to break out of the nursing home where he's in, because there's a story plot apparently that old people can't leave the nursing home. They show really an overview of who was in the nursing home, and we get to see a lot of familiar faces. I think Cartman's mom was in there, so I don't know if this is gonna come back later on and we're gonna get to see the parents. I would love to see them interacting with like their adult children now. And then there is this big question of whether or not Cartman is pretending to be Jewish to basically play a prank on Kyle. And at first I thought that, that this was just gonna be Kyle being Kyle. But the more that I think about it, because there's a really dark, a relatively dark joke where we find out that Stan was involved in the death of his sister and his mom. And that was pretty dark. So in my opinion, they're not gonna hold off on making this sort of Cartman is faking a joke, even though he has a wife and kid. Even though it might be expected, I still think it'd be a really interesting payoff to this potential joke. Now, if you're watching this for the jokes, which, let's be honest, a lot of people are watching South Park for the jokes, I will say that in the more recent years, the humor, or at least the humor that the show has relied on, has been a lot more self-referential jokes, where it's a lot more callbacks to earlier episodes or earlier seasons. But this special does have, joke after joke, from people overreacting to the COVID lockdowns. They even poke fun at anti vaxxers. What else? Jokes about face masks, jokes about even streaming services. Where here, like every company, like every store has a plus or a max after their name. So they're not holding back on who they make fun of. In the traditional South Park humor, they make fun of everyone. But I will say though that the comedy here feels very out of touch. There are moments where I did laugh, there are moments where I kind of rolled my eyes a bit. I feel like the comedy that Trey and Matt bring no longer feels like it's pushing boundaries. And even though they're not as boundary pushing in their humor, they're pushing boundaries when it comes to storytelling, specifically in this genre of adult animation. And they even went as far as doing something that people thought was never going to happen, which was tell a South Park story from the perspective of the boys as adults, and then the backdrop being where they mix these different genres of science fiction, wacky humor, and social political satire. It feels very rich. And with this episode, it feels like there's still a lot of that they still have a lot of fresh ideas, even though their humor might not be the best. And I do have one or two nitpicks. One of them is maybe comes from the boys being voiced by the same voice actors, and it's that they all generally sound the same. I think that the only one that really whose voice stands out is Kyle's voice, but other than that, for me, generally, I feel like there really wasn't an attempt to differentiate with the boys' voices. And then my other thing was the structure of the movie, because this feels like it's a third part. It picks up several story beats from the previous two specials, from the COVID vaccination stuff to the Integrity Farms to the boys' relationships. All of this sort of gets picked up in this, and it's a continuation of that. Even though you can watch this without seeing that, it does a fairly good enough job at explaining certain things where you don't really feel lost if you haven't watched those other two specials. But it really adds a lot more if you had seen them. Something that this movie doesn't show is the fallout of the boys. Maybe that's being kept for part two, but we do get to see that in the previous two specials. This is sort of dealing with the aftermath of their broship falling apart and then them having to deal with that as adults. That was the most interesting part of this movie, and I think that's the heart of this. But that there's a lot of setup, and that sliver of them having to deal with their broken broship comes at the last part. So I feel like right when they give you what you want, it sort of ends. And it's pretty much setting up for a part two. So, with all that said, I will say that this is very much for the fans of South Park who have been consistently watching the show for at least, if you've been watching it consistently, this is totally for you and you have probably already watched it. If you're someone who's been on and off watching South Park and you really haven't kept up with it, I will say if you really want to enjoy this movie, I'd say that for you to look for the two previous specials so that you can really get what they're going for in this movie. And for my final rating, I'd probably give it a 3 out of 5. It was good, it was serviceable. There was things I wish I would have seen in terms of the future, like where certain characters end up where we don't get to see them. Of course, there is one character in particular. I won't say it just not to spoil it, but they hint at him in the final scene of this, and I'm looking forward to seeing him in part two. And there are rumors that part two is dropping on Christmas Day, so that's something to look forward to. So yeah, 3 out of 5. I recommend watching it, but it's not the best thing that has come out of South Park in the last few years. And so yeah, with all that said, thank you for watching my review, and I'll see you all next time.